Bill Fletcher. He's been a longtime activist in the American labor movement, education director at the AFL-CIO, director at the SEIU, and of course has written a very well-known book to those of us following debates about union renewal in North America, titled Solidarity Divided, in particular dealing with the theme of how to remake the union movement and the left in North America.
Good evening. I want to also thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Socialist Project for sponsoring this program. This was a very difficult presentation for me to develop because it felt like there were a number of different things I wanted to get at. And I'm going to try to minimize the number, but I'm going to jump to the end of the story. The end of the story is that yesterday the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists got 2/3 of the vote in Egypt. Now, I start there because I think that if we and the left are not talking about the issue of power, we are playing one hell of a game. And it's a very dangerous one, right? Because when we have these mass movements that are emerging, the assumption that the mass movements on their own will bring about progress or bring about a progressive resolution to a crisis is wrong. It's fundamentally flawed. And what we saw in Egypt, and we saw elements of it in Tunisia, we see elements of it in Libya, is that you can have these incredible mass explosions. Tahrir Square was phenomenal. What took place in Tunisia was unbelievable. But what's critical was who was organized. Who was organized? What level of organization did they have? What was their history of activity? And it wasn't enough for all of the discussion about horizontalism and this and spontaneity. At the end of the day, the left got its ass kicked. And we've got to start there with that recognition. Anything else, as far as I'm concerned, is bullshit. Right? A highly scientific term. Because if we're not talking about power, and I think that this is part of what we're trying to get at this evening, if we're not talking about power, then what actually are we addressing? And so I start there because I want to now talk some about this issue about the left. And what exactly do we mean by the left? Everyone in here might be making certain assumptions, but I think we have to understand that there's multiple lefts that are in operation. And one variant of it is what we've seen in the rise with the Occupy Wall Street movement. About a year ago, when the North Atlantic Left Dialogue met in Berlin, one of the discussions, this was right after the midterm congressional elections in the United States. No one was very happy in the room. There was no sense of optimism. But one of the things that ended up being discussed some was that there was this poll in the United States. And the poll was an interesting one because it was revealed by the right and the left, but one of the people that revealed it was Bill O'Reilly. And what he said was, this poll indicated that 7 out of 10 people in the United States were opposed to socialism. Now what was interesting about this is that 3 out of 10 were interested in it, right? No, this is really interesting, right? So about figures don't lie, but liars figure, right? So it's really interesting. But this poll, this 30%, was actually confirmed by other polls. That is that roughly 30% of the population was open to alternatives. A figure that most of us on the left would never have conceived to have been the case. Most of us we've been walking around for years completely depressed, despairing, asking when the Kool-Aid will be passed out, etc. So 30%. What we are seeing in the Occupy Wall Street is that the mass base, that 30%, is serving, is what I would argue is the mass base for a mass left radicalism that exists. And as was earlier pointed out, what's interesting about this is that it is left. Leo mentioned this conference that took place in Washington, the Restore the American Dream. And you know, in the U.S. media, when they talk about left, they mean Bill Clinton on left, right? That's right. But so that gets everything very foggy, right, in terms of what we mean by left. But the Occupy Wall Street is speaking to, as was pointed out, this criticism of the system, and it's explicit in that. The Restore the American Dream conference, and I'm not going to jump on it, it was a conference of liberals and progressives that have a series of reform proposals, many of which are very, very important, and I think that they must be viewed as allies, not as the core. The core has to be this force of mass left radicalism, and mass left radicalism means that it is a movement that is not identified by one particular left tendency, but it is at its base criticizing the capitalist system. And that is where we actually have to be rooted. Now, in saying that, I'm not giving carte blanche to the Occupy Wall Street movement. As much and as excited as I am by that, there are significant limitations. And during the presentation, I was just thinking about a couple of things. Leo, I think it was mentioned earlier, crises of capitalism. In the 1870s in the United States, we had a massive strike in 1877. The great railroad, it was railroads that were at the center of these strikes. And these strikes were so powerful that the militias were called out, and this was very, very violent. But this was taking place at the same time that Reconstruction was being defeated. And there was absolutely no connection between these two movements. None. In the 1890s, in the midst of another great economic upheaval, we had the rise of this phenomenal populist movement that brought together farmers and workers, and particularly African American, some Latino, and Anglo farmers and workers. This movement rose. It was very significant. Yet it was taking place at the same time that Jim Crow, a quasi-fascist system that takes over the southern part of the United States, was being imposed, and disenfranchisement of African Americans and huge numbers of poor whites was underway, and these movements had nothing really to do with one another. We see in this Occupy Wall Street a very interesting rise of a segment of the population, and why it's happening now, I think in part reflects the downward mobility that is finally breaking through to large sections of the white population, that they are finally recognizing this is not a temporary phenomenon, that what many of us have been talking about for years of the declining living standard that begins in the 1970s is finally hitting home, and people are not prepared to accept that. That is, many white people. However, they were prepared to accept depression-like conditions for African Americans and Latinos that preceded this downturn. And so I would argue, and I'm going to end it here because I'm concerned about the time and I get homicidal when people fall asleep in front of me. I want to end it here, right? Because I want us to be thinking about the conclusions about this issue of the left and the central importance of bringing different segments of the left together. That it's not enough for us to fall in love with the Occupy Wall Street movement and to support it. We must do that. But it's not enough. We need to build this mass left radicalism. We need to institutionalize it. But we need to make sure, we have to ensure that that mass left radicalism really has deep roots in critical demographic sectors of the population. Otherwise, what we will see, I would suggest, is a variation of what happened in the 1870s and 1890s. A great popular explosion, followed by a period of significant reaction. Thank you very much.
Now we will hope for a popular explosion of questions to build on the innovative concept that Bill contributed tonight on bullshit. We've had a wide-ranging kind of set of observations on the terminal crisis of social democracy and some of the tactical issues of emerging out of the Occupy movement, and also the asymmetric, in particular the differential forms of the crisis inside Germany, which I'm sure will spark some discussion as well. So we'll open it up to the floor. We'll take half a dozen questions, then turn it back.